There's a specific kind of silence that happens right after you buy something you didn't need. Not the excited silence of anticipation, not the satisfied quiet of something well chosen. It's a different kind, softer, a little hollow, like the emotional energy that drove you to the purchase just evaporated the moment the transaction completed. You've probably felt it. Most people have. The package arrives, or the checkout screen confirms, and somewhere between the click and the delivery notification, whatever you were feeling starts to fade. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way a song feels different once you've heard it too many times. And the strange thing is, you knew, on some level, before you bought it, there was already a small part of you that understood it wouldn't fix anything. That the jacket wouldn't make you feel more confident in the way you were hoping. That the kitchen gadget would live in a drawer. That the course you impulse purchased at midnight would go unfinished. You knew, and you bought it anyway. That gap between what we know and what we do is one of the most quietly fascinating things about modern human behavior. And it's worth sitting with for a little while. Because the easy answer is willpower, or discipline, or the seductive powers of marketing. And sure, those things are real. Advertising is sophisticated. Algorithms are designed to understand your emotional state better than most people in your life do. The systems built around modern consumption are genuinely extraordinary at what they do, but the real reason we buy things we don't need isn't really about the products at all. It never was. It's about what's happening emotionally in the moments just before we reach for something. The specific texture of a Tuesday afternoon when work felt pointless and the apartment felt small. The low-grade restlessness of a Sunday that had too much empty space in it. The particular fatigue that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from carrying invisible pressure for too long without anywhere to put it down. Modern life generates a very specific kind of emotional noise. It's not always dramatic. It doesn't always feel like sadness or anxiety in any recognizable form. It's more like a persistent hum, a background dissatisfaction that most people learn to manage rather than examine. And somewhere along the way, consumption became one of the primary tools for managing it. Not because we're weak, not because we're foolish, but because it genuinely works. For a little while, the anticipation of a purchase is real. The neurological response to novelty is real. The brief expansion of mood that comes from choosing something, owning something, having something new to look forward to. That's not imaginary. It's a legitimate emotional experience. The problem isn't that it doesn't work. The problem is that it doesn't last. And because it doesn't last, the cycle begins again, usually faster than the last time. And somewhere in that cycle, spending stops being about the things and starts being about something much harder to name. Psychologists have a phrase for it: hedonic adaptation, the process by which human beings return to a relatively stable level of emotional experience regardless of what happens to them, positive or negative. You get the promotion, and within a few months it just feels like your job. You move into the bigger apartment, and within a season it just feels like home. The new phone that felt genuinely exciting for the first 2 weeks becomes invisible by the third. It's not ingratitude, it's biology. The human nervous system was never designed for permanent satisfaction. It was designed for survival, which means it was designed to always be looking for the next thing, the next threat, the next resource, the next improvement. Contentment, from an evolutionary standpoint, is almost dangerous. A fully satisfied animal stops paying attention, and an animal that stops paying attention doesn't last very long. So we inherited nervous systems that are extraordinarily good at wanting and remarkably poor at staying satisfied. And then we built an entire economic system around that exact vulnerability, which sounds cynical. Maybe it is, but it's worth understanding clearly, because once you see the mechanism, the behavior starts to make a different kind of sense. Think about the last time you found yourself browsing something you weren't planning to buy, not searching with intention, just scrolling, moving through images and prices and descriptions with no particular destination. There's a specific quality to that kind of browsing. It has the texture of looking for something without quite knowing what. A low-grade restlessness disguised as leisure, and the digital environment is perfectly constructed for that state. Infinite scroll removes the natural stopping points that physical spaces provide. Recommended products appear based on emotional patterns you didn't consciously share, but algorithmically revealed through behavior. Flash sales create urgency where none organically existed. Free shipping thresholds encourage you to spend slightly more than you intended to qualify for something that feels like a reward. None of this is accidental. The architecture of modern consumption is built around a detailed understanding of human psychology, and most of it operates just below the threshold of conscious awareness. But here's the part that rarely gets examined. The reason these systems work so effectively isn't just because they're sophisticated. It's because they're meeting a genuine emotional need, just not in a way that actually resolves it. Boredom is real. Loneliness is real. The particular heaviness of a life that feels slightly misaligned with what you hoped it would be, that's real too. And when those feelings surface, the friction to simply open an app and begin browsing is almost zero. The friction to examine the feeling, sit with it, understand it, is considerably higher. So people choose the easier path, not because they're avoiding growth, but because the day was already long, and the feeling is uncomfortable, and the phone is right there, and the app loads in seconds, and for a few minutes at least, the restlessness quiets down. That's not weakness. That's a completely understandable human response to an environment that was designed, with remarkable precision, to produce exactly that response. The uncomfortable part is noticing how rarely we question it. There's a concept in behavioral economics called the identity purchase connection. The idea that people don't just buy products, they buy versions of themselves. Or more accurately, they buy the feeling of moving toward a version of themselves they haven't become yet. The running shoes aren't really about running. They're about the person who runs. The books stacked on the nightstand aren't really about reading. They're about the person who reads seriously, who thinks carefully, who invests in their own mind. The expensive coffee equipment isn't about coffee. It's about the quiet morning ritual, the slowness, the intentionality, the life that feels curated rather than chaotic. And there's something genuinely poignant about that. Because underneath every impulsive or unnecessary purchase, there's usually a real aspiration, a real desire for something better, something different, something that feels more like the life a person imagined for themselves. The purchase is a shortcut to the feeling of that life, without requiring the actual work, the actual time, the actual change that would produce it. And for a few hours, sometimes even a few days, it works. The shoes sit by the door, and the possibility of becoming someone who runs feels genuinely close. The books sit on the shelf, and the person who reads them feels like a future that's already partially arrived. And then life continues. The shoes stay by the door, the books stay on the shelf, and slowly, the gap between the purchased version of yourself and the actual version of yourself becomes its own quiet source of discomfort, which sometimes generates another purchase. To close the gap again, to restore the feeling of forward movement, to recapture the brief sensation that you are, in fact, becoming. If that sounds familiar, it's because most people are living somewhere inside that cycle without quite having the language for it. Maybe that's part of the problem. We talk about spending habits as if they're primarily financial. We frame it as budgeting failures or lack of self-control or the inevitable result of clever marketing. And those conversations are useful, but they miss something quieter and more important. Most unnecessary spending isn't really about money. It's about emotional management in a world that provides very few other tools for it. Think about what modern life actually asks of people. Extended periods of sitting in fluorescent light performing tasks that feel only loosely connected to anything meaningful. Social comparison delivered continuously and directly to your pocket. The persistent ambient pressure of economic uncertainty that nobody quite talks about directly, but that most people carry in some form every single day. The particular loneliness of being constantly connected and somehow still quietly isolated. If these conversations help you slow down and think a little differently about modern life, you're welcome to stay around. Most of us aren't looking for answers exactly. We're just looking for a clearer way to understand what we're already experiencing. Because the exhaustion people feel isn't always about working too hard. Sometimes it's about the emotional labor of constantly managing feelings that were never really addressed. Just redirected toward a cart, toward a checkout, toward the brief and genuine relief of having chosen something, even when the something doesn't matter very much at all. There's a particular moment that happens sometimes, late at night, when the screen is finally off and the apartment is quiet and there's nothing left to scroll through or purchase or anticipate. And in that silence, something surfaces. Not dramatically, not with urgency, just quietly. A kind of stillness that modern life spends enormous energy helping people avoid. Because stillness is uncomfortable when you're not used to it. When the background noise of consumption and stimulation and novelty is removed, what remains is just you, your actual thoughts, your actual feelings. The gap between where you are and where you quietly hoped you'd be by now. The questions you've been too busy to sit with. The things you want that can't be added to a cart. And maybe that's what most unnecessary spending is actually protecting people from. Not boredom exactly. Something closer to clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives when the noise stops long enough for the real signal to come through. Most people don't think of shopping as an avoidance mechanism. It doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like doing something, making a decision, taking action, moving forward. And in a life where genuine forward movement often feels slow and uncertain and largely outside your control, the ability to simply choose something and have it confirmed and delivered carries a real psychological weight. It feels like agency, even when it isn't really. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first, because agency, real agency, requires confronting the things that are actually making you feel stuck. The career that feels misaligned, the relationship that has quietly drifted, the life that looks functional from the outside and feels slightly hollow from the inside. And confronting those things is hard and slow and uncertain in a way that browsing never is. So people browse instead, and spend instead, and accumulate instead, not because they're confused about what they really need, but because what they really need is significantly harder to obtain than anything available for next-day delivery. The strange irony of modern consumer culture is that it's simultaneously a response to genuine emotional need and a system that ensures that need is never quite met. Because a person whose emotional needs are genuinely satisfied doesn't consume compulsively, doesn't reach for the phone automatically, doesn't feel the low pull of the cart at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. A genuinely emotionally nourished person is, from a purely commercial standpoint, not a particularly useful person. So the systems around us are not designed to produce emotional nourishment. They're designed to produce emotional appetite. Perpetual, manageable, monetizable appetite. Understanding that doesn't make the appetite disappear, but it changes something in the relationship with it. There's a difference between being driven by a feeling and simply noticing a feeling, between automatically reaching for relief and pausing long enough to recognize what you're actually reaching for. That pause, small as it is where something different becomes possible. Not perfection, not permanent resistance, just a slightly clearer view of what's actually happening. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the most human thing you can do is simply notice the silence before filling it. Sit with what surfaces. Let it be there for a moment without immediately reaching for something to make it quieter. Maybe modern life feels a little lighter when we stop treating every uncomfortable feeling as a problem that needs to be purchased away. Maybe some of what we've been buying was just an answer to a question we were never quite ready to ask. And maybe that's worth sitting with for a little while.